The encounter. Kira Davis moved swiftly through the suburban streets, her senses heightened, her gaze steady. Known as one of the FBI's sharpest undercover agents, Kira had been tasked with infiltrating a high-profile drug cartel that hid behind suburban respectability. For months, she had carefully woven her way into this circle of affluent residents, building her cover as a real estate agent. But today was crucial. She was meeting with an informant who held the key to unraveling the cartel's leadership, a shadowy figure she'd pursued for months. Dressed casually to blend into the quiet neighborhood, Kira was almost invisible, just another resident on a late afternoon walk. Her phone buzzed, and she checked the message. Her informant was waiting at the small park on the edge of the neighborhood. She quickened her pace, rehearsing her lines for their conversation, maintaining her calm exterior. As she neared the park, the rumble of a police cruiser slowed her steps. The cruiser stopped a short distance away, and Kira tried to ignore it, focusing on her mission. But the officer's gaze lingered, and when he stepped out, Kira recognized him immediately. Officer Rick Jameson, a local cop notorious for his harsh and often biased policing methods. She'd heard of his reputation from the community and knew that he wasn't one to question his own authority. "Hey, you," he barked, his voice sharp. Kira continued her pace, hoping he'd turn his attention elsewhere. She had a job to do, and she couldn't risk her cover, not with so much at stake. "Miss, I'm talking to you," Officer Jameson called out, his voice hardening as he strode toward her, his hand resting on his holstered gun in a gesture meant to intimidate. Kira turned slowly, masking her frustration with a calm smile. "Just out for a walk," she replied, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Is there a problem, officer?" Rick's eyes narrowed as he assessed her, his gaze roving over her casual clothes and her dark skin with a skepticism she had seen far too often. "Not a lot of people just walk around in this neighborhood. I'm going to need to see some ID," he said, a smug look crossing his face. Kira's mind raced. Showing her FBI badge would immediately ruin her cover and endanger the operation she had spent months building. But refusing him could escalate the situation, especially with an officer like Jameson. She took a deep breath, reaching carefully for her wallet to pull out her civilian ID. But before she could even hand it to him, Jameson grabbed her wrist roughly, his fingers digging into her skin. "Let's not get cute," he growled, his eyes flashing with barely contained hostility. "You're coming with me to the station for questioning." Kira's jaw clenched as he yanked her toward his cruiser. She looked around at the nearby houses, where residents were starting to gather, watching the scene unfold from their windows and porches. Not a single one of them intervened, their expressions a mixture of idle curiosity and apathy. She bit down her anger, forcing herself to stay silent as Jameson shoved her into the back of his car. The drive to the station was tense, filled with Jameson's self-satisfied silence as he radioed in about his detainment of a suspicious person. Every second inside that cruiser felt like an eternity, but Kira held her composure. Revealing her identity was still an option, but she knew the risks. Her mission to expose the cartel was her priority, even if it meant enduring this humiliation. Finally, they arrived at the police station. Jameson opened the door, pulling her out roughly as he led her inside, his hand clamped around her arm in a display of control. Inside, officers glanced up, some with vague amusement, others with a casual disinterest that felt like a slap in the face. Jameson paraded her past his colleagues, his arrogance seeping into every step, as if he had just won a prize. Kira took a steadying breath, her mind racing with options. She could reveal her badge now, but it would compromise everything. The cartel was no ordinary operation. They had layers upon layers of protection, and any slip-up would send them into hiding, erasing all traces of their criminal activities. She couldn't let that happen, not after all the work she'd done. Jameson finally shoved her into a holding cell, locking the door with a grin that spoke volumes about his satisfaction. He leaned against the bars, folding his arms as he eyed her. "So, what were you really doing in that neighborhood?" He sneered. You know you don't belong there. Kira met his gaze, her expression calm but unreadable. Like I said, I was just out for a walk, she replied evenly. He laughed, shaking his head. You think you can just walk around like that, and no one's going to ask questions? People like you don't belong in those neighborhoods. But don't worry, we'll find out what you're really up to. The words stung, not because they were unexpected, but because she had heard them so many times before in her life. Kira had faced discrimination throughout her career, from both suspects and allies alike, but she never let it stop her. She took pride in her work, in her identity, and her unyielding commitment to justice. As Jameson strutted off, Kira sat down on the cold metal bench, her mind still on her mission. She had to get out of here, had to make that meeting. Her informant was waiting, and if he suspected she'd been compromised, he might disappear, taking all the information she needed with him. She was out of time, and had to think of a solution fast. Just then, she heard a new voice outside the holding cell. A younger officer, one she didn't recognize. He was speaking in a low voice, but she could still make out his words. Hey Jameson, there's something in her belongings I think you need to see. What is it? Jameson replied, sounding annoyed. Her ID. You should take a closer look. There was a moment of silence, and Kira felt a chill run down her spine. Her civilian ID must have slipped, exposing her FBI credentials beneath it. She had been careful to keep them separate, but in the chaos, something had gone wrong. She heard Jameson mutter something, and the sound of him flipping through her wallet. Then, a stunned silence. You're FBI. Jameson's voice was barely a whisper, his earlier smugness replaced by disbelief. Kira stood up, approaching the bars of the cell. She met his shocked gaze with a level stare, her voice steady. Special Agent Kira Davis, FBI. Jameson stumbled back, his face pale as he processed the realization of what he had done. The weight of his actions hung between them, the consequences of his bias crashing down on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Kira kept her eyes on him, her expression cool and unwavering. You didn't detain me because of anything I did, she said calmly, her voice low. You did it because of how I looked. And now, you'll have to live with that. As she stood there, watching him grapple with the full impact of his actions, Kira knew one thing. Her mission wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun, and now she had another battle to fight. A battle against the very system that allowed people like Jameson to act on their biases with impunity. This marks the beginning of Kira's journey, balancing her commitment to uncover the cartel with the pressing need to confront the prejudice and systemic bias that nearly cost her everything. As her mission unfolds, she will face both external enemies and the internal struggles within her own agency, pushing her to her limits as she fights for justice in every sense of the word. In the next parts, we will follow Kira as she navigates the complexities of her undercover operation while dealing with the aftermath of her encounter with Jameson, setting off a chain of events that will test her resilience, her values, and her courage. The mission and the fallout. After being released from the cell, Kira left the station, her heart still heavy with the weight of her encounter with Officer Jameson. She resisted the urge to confront him further, to make him feel the full force of her anger, knowing that would only be a distraction. Her mission was her priority, and she had to put her personal feelings aside. But as she walked away from the station, Kira couldn't shake the bitterness that had settled deep in her chest. The evening was setting in, casting a warm but fading glow over the neighborhood. Kira's mind was focused on her next steps. She knew her informant would have waited as long as he could at the park, and the last message she received told her he would be there any minute. Quickening her pace, she slid into her car and drove back toward the meeting spot. When she arrived, the park was deserted, save for a few stray joggers passing by. Kira parked discreetly and walked toward the far end of the park, where her informant usually waited for her. She had chosen this spot carefully, knowing it provided enough cover for discreet meetings. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different, heavy, as though the trees and the fading light were holding their breath. As she approached the bench, she caught sight of a figure seated there. He was slouched, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket, his gaze darting around the park as if he, too, sensed something was off. Kira knew him as Manny, a low-level member of the cartel who was tired of the life he had gotten himself into and desperate for a way out. "Manny," she called softly as she drew close. He looked up, his face tight with worry. "Sorry I'm late. I ran into some complications." "Complications, huh?" Manny's voice was tense, and his eyes flicked nervously around them. "Yeah, I'd say so. I thought you weren't coming." Kira sat beside him, her posture relaxed despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Things got a little heated with local law enforcement. Let's just say some people in this town are more interested in who they think belongs than in real criminals. Manny snorted, nodding as if he understood. "You'd be surprised how often that plays in our favor. No one expects a bunch of criminals hiding in plain sight. They don't bother with us, even when we're right under their noses." "Tell me about it," Kira muttered. She'd spent weeks gathering intelligence, uncovering how the cartel members blended into this upper-crust suburban neighborhood as if they belonged. They lived in expensive homes, went to exclusive events, and did business out of plain sight. Their activities were hidden behind the comfort and security of wealth, a barrier almost impossible to breach without the information Manny held. Manny cleared his throat, bringing her back to the task at hand. "Look, I don't have a lot of time, Agent Davis. The cartel's been on edge lately. I think they might be onto me. I've heard them talking about rats." He swallowed hard, his face betraying the fear he tried to hide. "I'm not sticking around to find out if they're talking about me." Kira studied him closely, catching the tension in his body language. "You're safe for now, Manny. You've been careful. Just give me the information you promised, and I'll get you out of here." Manny hesitated, glancing around again as if he expected someone to leap out of the shadows. "All right," he whispered, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. "I wrote down everything I know. Names, places, times. And the leader, he's someone you'd never expect. Not some low-life criminal." Kira nodded, feeling a cold dread spread through her. "Who is he?" "James Callahan," Manny whispered, his voice almost too soft to hear. "He's the leader of this operation. He uses his legitimate business as a front, real estate, investments. But that's just a cover. He's been running this cartel for years, laundering money, trafficking drugs, arms, you name it." The name stunned Kira. James Callahan was a respected businessman, a pillar of the community who donated to charities, sponsored city events, and even spoke at local schools. He had the reputation of a saint in the community, the last person anyone would suspect of criminal activity. "That's why he's untouchable," Manny continued, noticing her shock. "No one wants to believe it. And anyone who does ends up quieted. Callahan doesn't leave loose ends." Kira absorbed the information, feeling the gravity of what she had just learned. Taking down someone as powerful as Callahan would be no small feat. His network extended far beyond the cartel. He likely had people within law enforcement, the legal system, and local government on his payroll. This was a battle that would require more than just her skill as an agent. She would need unwavering patience, strategy, and courage to face the challenges ahead. "Thank you, Manny," she said, her voice low and steady. "This information is exactly what we need. You've done the right thing." Manny nodded, looking relieved but still wary. "Just make sure you hold up your end of the deal. I don't want to end up in the morgue over this." "You won't," Kira assured him. "You have my word." As they exchanged a quick handshake, Kira felt a surge of determination. Her mission was now crystal clear: bring down Callahan and dismantle the cartel's operation. But as she stood, ready to leave the park, the faint sound of footsteps echoed nearby. She froze, pulling Manny with her behind a large tree as two men emerged from the shadows. They looked around the park, their eyes cold and alert, scanning the area as if searching for someone. "Did you tell anyone about our meeting?" she whispered to Manny, her voice barely audible. He shook his head, eyes wide with panic. "No one. I swear." Kira's heart pounded as she watched the men move closer, their faces partially obscured by the dim light. She recognized them instantly, Callahan's enforcers. They were ruthless, loyal to him alone, and known for their brutal methods. "We need to move," she whispered to Manny, grabbing his arm as they backed away from the tree, inching toward a side path that led out of the park. "Stay low and follow me." They kept to the shadows, making their way through the trees and away from the men. But just as they neared the edge of the park, one of the enforcers turned, his gaze zeroing in on them. "Hey," he shouted, alerting his partner. "Over there." Without hesitation, Kira pulled Manny into a sprint, her mind racing. They weaved through the trees, the enforcers hot on their heels. Kira's heart pounded as she led Manny through a narrow alleyway, her only thought focused on getting them both to safety. They darted down several streets, losing their pursuers for a moment. But Kira knew they couldn't keep running. They needed somewhere to hide until the enforcers gave up the chase. "This way," she said, pulling Manny into the backyard of a nearby house. They crouched behind a tall hedge, trying to control their breathing as they listened for footsteps. After a few tense minutes, the sound of footsteps faded. Kira let out a sigh of relief, but her mind was still on high alert. They weren't out of danger yet. "You need to get out of town, Manny," she said firmly, her voice filled with urgency. "They're onto you. I'll make sure you're relocated and protected, but you can't stay here. You know too much." Manny nodded, his face pale. Yeah, I get it. Just make sure I'm not alone out there. I don't want them finding me." "I'll make sure of it," Kira promised. "Now go. Head to the location we talked about, and I'll handle the rest." Manny took one last look at her, gratitude mixed with fear in his eyes, before slipping away into the night. As Kira watched him go, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The stakes had risen, and she knew the risks she would face were greater than ever, but her resolve was unshakable. She was not only fighting to bring down a criminal empire, she was fighting against a system that allowed powerful men like Callahan to exploit their status and protect themselves from justice. As she turned and made her way back to her car, she knew that the confrontation with Officer Jameson had only been the beginning. She was prepared for the challenges ahead, knowing that her fight was now against more than just one criminal organization. It was a fight against the very structures of power and prejudice that protected people like Callahan. Her mission was about to get a lot more personal, and Kira was ready to see it through to the end. A dangerous web. Kira's footsteps echoed through the empty parking lot as she walked toward her car. Her mind replayed the events of the night, the encounter with Officer Jameson, the rush to meet Manny, the terrifying chase by Callahan's enforcers. The information Manny had given her was invaluable, yet it came with a chilling realization. The cartel wasn't just another criminal organization. It was deeply rooted in the city, woven into the fabric of local government, business, and law enforcement. And at its core was James Callahan, a man who wielded power with an iron grip, hiding his crimes behind a mask of philanthropy and respectability. Sliding into the driver's seat, Kira took a deep breath, steadying herself as she considered her next move. She knew that exposing Callahan wouldn't be easy. He had resources, influence, and loyal followers willing to do his bidding. But Kira also knew she was prepared for this. She'd faced dangerous figures before, but this was different. This was a battle that went beyond the physical. It would require a strategic mind, patience, and perhaps most importantly, allies she could trust. The phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID, Agent Riley, her partner and trusted friend within the FBI. Riley was one of the few people she could rely on, and his experience in undercover operations had made him her confidant on this case. "Davis," she answered, her voice steady. "Kira, are you okay?" Riley's voice was laced with concern. I heard you had a run-in with the locals. Kira sighed, the memory of Officer Jameson's smug face flashing in her mind. Yeah, you could say that. Let's just say it wasn't a warm welcome. Did you manage to get the intel? He asked, shifting to a more serious tone. I did. Callahan is the leader, Riley. He's been running the cartel for years, using his business empire as a front. Manny gave me names, locations, even some of the cartel's laundering operations. It's everything we need to move forward, but it won't be easy. Callahan's protected, probably has people on the inside. Riley let out a low whistle. That explains why he's been so hard to pin down. If we're dealing with a network that reaches into law enforcement, even the courts, this is going to be a high-stakes operation. We can't afford any mistakes. Kira nodded, a sense of determination settling over her. I know, but we have to bring him down, Riley. This isn't just about the cartel. It's about the lives they've destroyed, the corruption they've fed. Callahan's been operating in the shadows for too long. He thinks he's untouchable. And he's not going to take this lying down, Riley replied, his voice somber. You've rattled the cage, Kira. He'll know someone's onto him, especially if Manny's gone missing. We need to be careful. I'm ready, Kira said firmly. I've come this far. I'm not about to back down now. There was a pause, and she could almost hear Riley thinking on the other end. All right, he said finally. We'll start with the intel Manny gave you. I'll run it through our system, see if we can verify some of the names and locations. But be careful, Kira. If Callahan has people on the inside, we don't know who we can trust. Understood, she replied. Let's keep this between us for now. I don't want any leaks. After they ended the call, Kira sat for a moment, the gravity of the mission settling heavily on her shoulders. She knew that in going after Callahan, she wasn't just challenging one man. She was challenging an entire network of power and influence. But she had made a promise to herself long ago. She would fight for justice, no matter the cost. The next morning, Kira arrived at her office early, her mind already focused on the day's tasks. She spent hours sifting through the information Manny had provided, analyzing documents, cross-referencing names, and studying the cartel's financial records. As she pieced together the cartel's web, a picture began to emerge, one that painted Callahan as a mastermind, orchestrating a complex network of criminal activities from behind his polished public image. But as she worked, a nagging feeling of unease settled in. Kira knew that if Callahan suspected she was onto him, he would retaliate. He'd proven his ruthlessness over the years, silencing anyone who threatened his empire. Her instincts told her to be cautious, but her commitment to her mission outweighed any fear. As she pored over the files, she noticed something strange, a pattern in the financial transactions that seemed out of place. Certain large sums were transferred regularly to a small law firm in the city, a firm that didn't appear to have any direct connection to Callahan's business. Curiosity piqued. She dug deeper, uncovering a trail that led to an unassuming man named Victor Hastings, the firm's owner. Victor Hastings had no criminal record, no known affiliations with the cartel, and was considered an upstanding lawyer. But the frequent payments hinted at something deeper. Hastings was likely the cartel's legal advisor, a key player in laundering money and covering up illegal activities. If she could get to him, she might be able to unravel more of Callahan's operation. Kira picked up her phone and dialed Riley. I found something, she said as soon as he answered. There's a law firm, Victor Hastings. He's been receiving regular payments from Callahan's accounts. I think he might be our link to the cartel's legal cover. Riley whistled on the other end. Smart move, Kira. A guy like Callahan would need someone to handle the paperwork, make everything look clean. Hastings might have the answers we're looking for. We need to bring him in, Kira replied. But carefully. If he knows we're onto him, he might destroy evidence or alert Callahan. I'll set up a team to surveil him, Riley said. We'll keep it low-key, make sure he doesn't suspect a thing. You've given us a good lead, Kira. Let's see where it takes us. As they ended the call, Kira felt a surge of hope. She was finally making progress, getting closer to exposing Callahan's operation. But even as she felt that satisfaction, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if Callahan's reach extended even into the safety of her office. She decided to check her surroundings, a habit born out of years of undercover work. But everything seemed in order, and her colleagues went about their day as usual. Sighing, Kira pushed the feeling aside, refocusing on the files before her. The following day, Kira and Riley met in a discreet coffee shop on the edge of town. It was a familiar meeting spot, chosen for its privacy and distance from the watchful eyes of the city. Riley had a cautious but optimistic look in his eyes as they sat down. "We've been following Hastings. So far, he's had 2 meetings with unknown individuals, both men in dark suits, possibly cartel enforcers. They meet in random locations, sometimes hotels, sometimes parking lots, but nothing concrete enough to bring him in." Kira leaned forward, her mind working through the possibilities. "Do we know if he has any personal connections to Callahan? Family, friends, anyone that might give him a reason to stay loyal?" Riley shook his head. "None that we found. Hastings seems to be in this for the money. He's quiet, keeps a low profile, but he's definitely not clean." Kira considered this, her mind churning with ideas. "I think we need to put pressure on him, make him feel cornered. If he thinks we're close to discovering his role, he might turn on Callahan to save himself." Riley nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Agreed. But we need to be subtle. We can't let Callahan suspect that we're closing in." Kira's phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach drop. It was an anonymous text, a single line that sent a chill through her veins. "We're watching you, Agent Davis." She stared at the message, her mind racing. Someone knew she was onto Callahan. It could only mean one thing: she had been compromised. Riley noticed her expression and leaned closer. "What is it?" She showed him the text, her voice tense. "They know, Riley. They're onto me." Riley's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. "We need to act fast. If they're aware of your involvement, they'll come after you." Kira took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Then we have to move forward with our plan. We can't afford to wait. We'll put pressure on Hastings, make him give us what we need to take Callahan down." Riley nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll increase surveillance around your place, and I'll inform the higher-ups. We'll have backup on standby. Just be careful, Kira." Kira offered him a tight smile. "Careful's my middle name." But as she walked out of the coffee shop, she felt the weight of the message pressing down on her. She was no longer operating in the shadows. She was now a target. And as much as she trusted her skills, she knew that Callahan's people were ruthless. Turning up the heat. The next few days were a tense blur as Kira and Riley worked together, gathering evidence and planning their approach. With the anonymous threat looming over her, Kira was constantly on edge, her instincts on high alert. She knew Callahan's reach extended into nearly every corner of the city, and if he was aware of her involvement, he wouldn't hesitate to take drastic measures to protect his empire. Determined to stay a step ahead, Kira pushed harder than ever, analyzing every piece of data Manny had given her, tracing the intricate web of connections that linked Callahan to his cartel. She knew the key to bringing him down lay with Victor Hastings, the lawyer who had been covering Callahan's tracks for years. But she needed more leverage over Hastings to make him talk, to force him into cooperating without tipping off the cartel. Kira returned to the FBI office early in the morning before most of her colleagues arrived. Her desk was piled high with documents and case files, each one a small piece of the sprawling puzzle that was Callahan's operation. She was in the middle of reviewing a set of suspicious financial transactions when Riley walked in, his face set with grim determination. "We need to talk," he said, his tone low. "Hastings isn't making this easy. We've been following him. But he's slippery, seems to know how to avoid leaving a trail. But I think we might have something." He placed a thin file on her desk, nodding for her to open it. Inside were surveillance photos of Hastings meeting with an older man outside a nondescript building on the outskirts of town. Kira's eyes narrowed as she studied the photos. The man was unfamiliar, but his posture and the way he interacted with Hastings spoke volumes. He wasn't just another contact. He was someone Hastings respected, possibly even feared. "Who is he?" Kira asked, looking up at Riley. "Name's Harold Kingston," Riley replied. "Ex-military, now works in private security. He's known for taking on discreet jobs for high-paying clients, the kind of jobs that don't leave paperwork. We did a little digging, and it turns out Kingston has been working as Callahan's head of security for years." Kira's mind raced as she processed the information. If Hastings is meeting with Kingston, that means he's worried. He knows he's under surveillance, and he's probably trying to cover his tracks. But if we can get to Kingston— "Exactly," Riley interrupted, a spark of hope in his eyes. "Kingston is loyal to Callahan, but he's not untouchable. He's got a record of his own, things he wouldn't want getting out. We could use that against him, make him an offer he can't refuse." Kira nodded, her determination hardening. "Then let's do it. We'll bring Kingston in quietly. If we can get him to flip, he might give us exactly what we need to force Hastings into cooperating. But we need to be careful. If Kingston suspects anything, he'll alert Callahan." Riley agreed, and they spent the rest of the day planning the operation to bring in Kingston. By the time evening fell, they had a solid plan in place. Kingston frequented a high-end cigar bar on the outskirts of town, a place where he met with his contacts and conducted his business away from prying eyes. They would intercept him there, posing as fellow patrons, and get him alone before he had a chance to react. The following night, Kira and Riley arrived at the cigar bar dressed in plain clothes, blending in with the wealthy clientele. The dim lighting and jazz music created an atmosphere of sophistication, a perfect cover for the kind of shady dealings Kingston specialized in. Kira scanned the room, spotting Kingston seated in a booth at the back, surrounded by empty glasses and a thick cloud of cigar smoke. She exchanged a glance with Riley, who gave her a subtle nod. They approached the booth, and Kira slid into the seat across from Kingston, her expression calm but unreadable. "Harold Kingston?" she asked, her voice steady. Kingston looked up, his eyes narrowing as he assessed them. "Who's asking?" "We're not here to cause trouble," Kira replied, leaning forward. "We just need to have a conversation about Callahan." Kingston's expression hardened, but he didn't move. He took a slow drag of his cigar, his eyes never leaving Kira's face. "I don't know who you think you are, but if you know what's good for you, you'll turn around and walk out." "See, that's the thing," Riley said, leaning back casually. "We do know who you are, Harold. We know exactly what kind of business you run for Callahan, the things you do to keep his empire safe. But we also know about some things you'd rather keep hidden. Things that might be damaging if they came to light." Kingston's jaw tightened, his posture shifting slightly as if preparing for a confrontation. But Kira held his gaze, her tone calm but firm. "We're giving you a choice, Kingston. Help us bring Callahan down, and we can make this easier for you. Resist, and we'll make sure every secret you're hiding becomes public knowledge. You'll be left out in the cold, just another disposable asset." For a long moment, Kingston said nothing. He stared at them, his gaze filled with anger and calculation. But finally, he let out a bitter laugh, crushing his cigar in the ashtray. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Information," Kira replied. "We need to know where Callahan's main operations are based, the people he relies on. We need enough to turn Hastings against him." Kingston leaned back, crossing his arms as he considered her words. "You're asking me to betray a man who's kept me comfortable for years. Why should I risk my life for you?" "Because Callahan will cut you loose the moment you're no longer useful," Riley replied coldly. "You know that as well as we do. He's loyal to no one but himself. But if you help us, we can protect you, make sure you come out of this clean." Kingston's face twisted with frustration, but Kira could see the gears turning in his mind. He was calculating the risks, weighing his loyalty to Callahan against his own survival. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh, nodding slowly. The following night, Kira and Riley arrived at the cigar bar dressed in plain clothes, blending in with the wealthy clientele. The dim lighting and jazz music created an atmosphere of sophistication, a perfect cover for the kind of shady dealings Kingston specialized in. Kira scanned the room, spotting Kingston seated in a booth at the back, surrounded by empty glasses and a thick cloud of cigar smoke. She exchanged a glance with Riley, who gave her a subtle nod. They approached the booth, and Kira slid into the seat across from Kingston, her expression calm but unreadable. "Harold Kingston?" she asked, her voice steady. Kingston looked up, his eyes narrowing as he assessed them. "Who's asking?" "We're not here to cause trouble," Kira replied, leaning forward. "We just need to have a conversation. About Callahan." Kingston's expression hardened, but he didn't move. He took a slow drag of his cigar, his eyes never leaving Kira's face. "I don't know who you think you are, but if you know what's good for you, you'll turn around and walk out." "See, that's the thing," Riley said, leaning back casually. "We do know who you are, Harold. We know exactly what kind of business you run for Callahan, the things you do to keep his empire safe. But we also know about some things you'd rather keep hidden, things that might be damaging if they came to light." Kingston's jaw tightened, his posture shifting slightly as if preparing for a confrontation. But Kira held his gaze, her tone calm but firm. "We're giving you a choice, Kingston. Help us bring Callahan down, and we can make this easier for you. Resist, and we'll make sure every secret you're hiding becomes public knowledge. You'll be left out in the cold, just another disposable asset." For a long moment, Kingston said nothing. He stared at them, his gaze filled with anger and calculation. But finally, he let out a bitter laugh, crushing his cigar in the ashtray. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Information," Kira replied. "We need to know where Callahan's main operations are based, the people he relies on. We need enough to turn Hastings against him." Kingston leaned back, crossing his arms as he considered her words. "You're asking me to betray a man who's kept me comfortable for years. Why should I risk my life for you?" "Because Callahan will cut you loose the moment you're no longer useful," Riley replied coldly. "You know that as well as we do. He's loyal to no one but himself. But if you help us, we can protect you, make sure you come out of this clean." Kingston's face twisted with frustration, but Kira could see the gears turning in his mind. He was calculating the risks, weighing his loyalty to Callahan against his own survival. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh, nodding slowly. "Fine," he muttered. "But if I'm going to do this, I want guarantees. I want immunity, protection, everything you can offer." "You'll get it," Kira promised. "But you need to cooperate fully." Kingston nodded again, a look of resignation in his eyes. "All right. There's a warehouse on the south side of town. That's where Callahan keeps his records. Transaction logs, contacts, everything. It's heavily guarded, but if you can get in, you'll find enough evidence to take him down." Kira exchanged a glance with Riley, excitement and relief flooding through her. This was the break they had been waiting for, the piece of evidence that could finally expose Callahan's operation. "We'll arrange a time to bring you in," Kira said, standing up. "Stay low, and don't make any moves that might tip Callahan off. We'll be in touch." As they left the cigar bar, Kira felt a surge of adrenaline. They were finally closing in on Callahan, unraveling the threads of his operation piece by piece. But she knew they weren't out of danger yet. Callahan was ruthless, and if he caught wind of their plan, he wouldn't hesitate to strike back. The next morning, Kira and Riley gathered a small team of trusted agents, carefully selecting only those they knew they could rely on. They reviewed Kingston's intel, studying blueprints of the warehouse and mapping out their approach. The plan was simple but high risk. They would enter the warehouse under cover of darkness, seize the records, and leave before Callahan's men realized what had happened. That night, Kira and her team approached the warehouse in silence, their movements coordinated and precise. The air was thick with tension as they navigated the perimeter, evading security cameras and bypassing the guards stationed around the building. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of shelves and crates, filled with everything from office supplies to expensive furniture, items meant to disguise the cartel's true purpose. Kira led the team toward a back room, where Kingston had said they would find the records. As they entered, her heart pounded with anticipation. Rows of filing cabinets and shelves lined the walls, each drawer labeled with cryptic codes. Kira and Riley quickly set to work, scanning documents and photographing evidence. The files revealed everything they needed: transactions, lists of contacts, even details of Callahan's bribes to government officials. But as they worked, a faint noise caught Kira's attention. She froze, signaling to Riley, and they listened as the sound grew louder. Footsteps, approaching fast. "They're onto us," Riley whispered, his voice tense. "We need to move." Kira grabbed the files they had photographed, stuffing them into her bag. She signaled to the team, and they began to retreat, their footsteps silent as they moved through the darkened warehouse. But as they neared the exit, a blinding light flooded the room, and armed men appeared, blocking their path. Kira's heart raced as she realized they were trapped. Callahan's men had found them, and there was no way out. One of the men stepped forward, a cold smile on his face. "Did you really?" The trap tightens. The armed men closed in, their footsteps echoing in the vast silence of the warehouse. Kira and her team were trapped, the exit blocked by Callahan's enforcers, each man holding a weapon aimed with ruthless precision. Kira's mind raced, weighing their options. Every instinct screamed that they were in grave danger. She exchanged a quick glance with Riley. His eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. There was no room for error here. Any wrong move could be fatal. The leader of Callahan's enforcers, a tall, imposing man with a scar across his cheek, took a step forward. His cold gaze swept over them, lingering on Kira. "Thought you'd be smarter than this, Agent Davis," he sneered. "But I guess even the best slip up sometimes." Kira kept her expression neutral, her mind working at lightning speed. She could see Riley's hand inching toward his sidearm, and she subtly shook her head, signaling him to hold back. This wasn't the time for a firefight. They were outnumbered and outgunned. If they wanted to survive, they needed to play it smart. "Seems like you know more about me than I'd like," Kira replied, keeping her tone steady. "But I don't think Callahan hired you for your wit. What exactly are you planning to do with us?" The man chuckled darkly, folding his arms. "Oh, Callahan doesn't take kindly to people snooping in his business. You're in his warehouse, going through his records, and that's not something he forgives. But he likes a good show, you see. He's on his way here as we speak. Wants to see the people foolish enough to challenge him." Kira felt a chill run down her spine. If Callahan was coming here personally, he likely intended to deal with them himself. She'd seen enough cartel bosses in her career to know that they took betrayal very personally. Callahan would want to make an example out of them. Riley stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "You think this is going to end well for you?" he asked, his voice laced with defiance. "You're protecting a man who would throw you under the bus the moment you're no longer useful. We know more than you think, and it's only a matter of time before the entire world knows who Callahan really is." The enforcer's face darkened, his eyes narrowing. "Big words for a man with a gun pointed at him," he spat. "But you're right. Callahan will know who you are, and he'll make sure you never forget." Kira glanced around, her gaze sweeping over the enforcers, taking in their positions, their stances. They weren't as disciplined as she'd expected, slightly careless, possibly overconfident given the numbers advantage. They hadn't expected resistance, which meant there was still a slim chance they could escape. Then she noticed something, A stack of large crates piled near one of the warehouse's structural pillars, just a few feet from where she and Riley stood. It was a risky plan, but if they could use the crates as cover and make it to the emergency exit, they might have a shot. Kira leaned subtly toward Riley, speaking under her breath. When I give the signal, we make a break for those crates. Use them as cover. There's an emergency exit to the left. We might have a chance if we're quick. Riley nodded slightly, his body tense, ready to move at a moment's notice. She could feel the weight of the moment, the electric tension filling the air as they prepared for what could be their only chance at survival. The enforcer raised his weapon, a twisted smile on his face as he took aim. Time's up. Before he could pull the trigger, Kira shouted, "Now!" She threw herself toward the crates, pulling Riley with her as they dove behind the towering stack. Gunshots rang out, bullets whizzing past them as they crouched low, using the crates for cover. Kira returned fire, her aim precise as she targeted the enforcers closest to them. The chaos of the firefight filled the warehouse, the sound of gunfire echoing off the walls. Kira and her team moved with calculated precision, using the darkness and their training to their advantage. They pressed forward, inching closer to the emergency exit with every shot. As they neared the door, one of Callahan's men lunged forward, grabbing Riley and pulling him to the ground. Kira's heart skipped a beat as she turned, her instincts kicking in. She fired a shot, hitting the man in the leg and sending him sprawling to the floor. Riley scrambled to his feet, nodding in thanks as they continued their escape. Finally, they reached the exit, bursting out into the cold night air. The alleyway was dark, the streetlights casting long shadows across the ground as they sprinted away from the warehouse. Kira didn't look back, her focus solely on getting her team to safety. She could hear footsteps behind them, the enforcers giving chase, but she knew they had the advantage now. They were trained for this, and they weren't about to let Callahan's men catch them. They ducked into a side street, hiding behind a row of parked cars as they caught their breath. Kira's mind raced, adrenaline still pumping through her veins. They had narrowly escaped, but she knew this was far from over. Callahan would come after them with everything he had, and they needed to act fast if they were going to take him down before he had a chance to retaliate. Back at the safe house, Kira and Riley gathered around the table with the team, their expressions grim but determined. The files they had retrieved from the warehouse lay spread out in front of them, each document a piece of evidence linking Callahan to his criminal empire. But they needed more. They needed a way to bring all of this into the open, to expose Callahan's operation in a way that couldn't be ignored. Kira looked up, meeting the eyes of each team member. "We're close," she said, her voice steady. "We have enough evidence to connect Callahan to the cartel, but we need a way to make this public. If we try to take this through official channels, he'll find a way to bury it. He has too many people on the inside." Riley nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "We could leak the documents to the media, get the story out there before Callahan even knows what hit him. But it would have to be coordinated, a way to ensure the evidence is undeniable." One of the younger agents, Martinez, raised his hand. "What about a press conference? We go public ourselves, present the evidence directly to the media. If we do it right, Callahan won't have time to react." Kira considered this, the idea taking shape in her mind. It was risky, but it could work. A public press conference would put Callahan on the defensive, forcing him to respond in a way he couldn't control. And with the media involved, the scrutiny would be intense, making it nearly impossible for him to silence the truth. "All right," she said finally, her voice filled with determination. "We'll set up a press conference. Martinez, start reaching out to trusted reporters. Make sure they understand the gravity of this story and the need for secrecy until we go live. We'll schedule it for tomorrow morning." The team nodded, each one focused and ready. They had come too far to back down now, and they knew the risks, but they were prepared to do whatever it took to bring Callahan to justice. As the team dispersed to prepare, Kira pulled Riley aside, her expression serious. "We need to be ready for anything. Callahan won't go down without a fight, And if he gets wind of this, he'll strike back. Make sure everyone is armed and alert. We can't afford to let our guard down." Riley nodded, his face grim. "Understood. I'll double security on the safe house and have backup ready on standby. We're going to see this through, Kira. Callahan's reign ends here." The next morning, the press conference was set up at a secure location, an old warehouse that had been converted into a makeshift media center. The team had arranged for trusted media outlets to attend, reporters who were known for their integrity and willingness to take on powerful figures. Kira took a deep breath as she stepped onto the makeshift stage, the bright lights of the cameras trained on her. She could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of the world on her as she prepared to expose Callahan's crimes. Riley stood by her side, a reassuring presence, and she knew that no matter what happened, they had done everything they could to bring the truth to light. She looked out at the gathered reporters, each one eager for the story that would undoubtedly shake the city to its core. Holding up the files, she began to speak, her voice clear and resolute. "Today, we are here to reveal the truth about a man who has hidden his crimes behind a mask of respectability, a man who has used his power and influence to evade justice for far too long. James Callahan, a respected businessman and philanthropist, is the leader of one of the most dangerous criminal cartels in this city. We have gathered irrefutable evidence linking him to drug trafficking, money laundering, and countless acts of violence." The room was silent, every person hanging on her words as she laid out the evidence, each document a damning piece of the puzzle. She held nothing back, revealing the full extent of Call. The final stand. Kira's words echoed through the makeshift media center, a tidal wave of truth that left the audience stunned. Reporters scribbled furiously, recording her every word as she methodically revealed James Callahan's empire of crime. With each new piece of evidence, each name, each corrupt transaction, the image of Callahan, the polished businessman and community benefactor, crumbled, exposing the monstrous reality beneath. The gravity of what they were doing weighed heavily on Kira. She knew the risks of challenging a man like Callahan in such a public way. He had the resources to retaliate, a network of loyalists willing to protect him at any cost. But she also knew that once the truth was out, there would be no going back for him. They had forced him out of the shadows, and now the entire city was watching. As she finished her statement, Kira glanced at Riley, who gave her a firm nod of support. The room was buzzing with the intensity of the moment, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, but she held her ground, exuding calm and determination. "This operation is just the beginning," she said, her voice unwavering. "We will continue to dismantle every part of Callahan's organization, bring every accomplice to justice, and ensure that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." The press conference ended with a flood of questions, but Kira and Riley remained focused, offering only the facts and directing reporters to the FBI's official statement. By the time they stepped off the stage, Kira could feel the exhaustion settling in, but there was no time to rest. This was only the beginning of the battle. As she exited the media center, her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, her heart sinking when she saw the caller ID. It was from a blocked number, likely Callahan himself. Taking a deep breath, she accepted the call, bracing herself. "Agent Davis," Callahan's voice drawled, smooth and calm, with an undercurrent of menace. "Quite a show you put on back there. You must be feeling very pleased with yourself." Kira's grip tightened on the phone. "It's over, Callahan. Your empire, your lies, they're all coming down. You can't hide anymore." He chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down her spine. "You really think a few papers and a press conference are enough to stop me? I've spent years building my reputation, my connections. People in this city know who I am. They trust me. You're just another name, a disposable asset, like all the others who tried and failed to take me down." "Maybe you're right," Kira replied evenly. "But those papers are hard evidence, and they're already in the hands of the media, the FBI, and every law enforcement agency watching. Your reputation won't save you this time. There was a pause, then his voice turned cold and deadly. You don't understand who you're dealing with, Agent Davis. You're not untouchable. I have ways of handling people who threaten me. She held her breath, refusing to let him see any fear. Then I'll see you in court, Callahan, she said calmly. And when I do, you'll wish you had never made this call. She ended the call before he could respond, her heart pounding. She knew this was far from over. Callahan would be desperate now, willing to do anything to protect himself. And as dangerous as he was, desperation made him even more unpredictable. Back at the FBI headquarters, Kira and Riley gathered their team in a secure briefing room. They had just enough time to strategize before the fallout began, knowing Callahan wouldn't waste a second planning his next move. Riley stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. We need to brace ourselves. Callahan's assets will go into hiding, his contacts will start erasing evidence, and his allies within the system will do everything they can to undermine us. We're going to be up against more than just his cartel. We're facing a network of powerful people who want this buried. Kira nodded, her gaze sweeping over the team. That's why we're moving fast. I want each of you to follow up on every piece of evidence we've gathered. Bring in his associates, shut down his safe houses, freeze his assets, and watch your backs. Callahan won't hesitate to use force if he thinks it'll keep him out of prison. The team dispersed, each agent fully aware of the gravity of their task. As Kira watched them leave, she felt a mix of pride and tension. She knew they were capable, but the risk was greater than ever. Callahan's reach extended further than they could see, and he would fight with everything he had. Riley approached her, his expression serious. We're going to be okay, Kira. We have him cornered. He can't buy his way out of this. She nodded, appreciating his confidence, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, a final move from Callahan that could end everything they'd worked for. They were close, but close wasn't good enough. They needed to be sure. As night fell, Kira returned to her apartment, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She had hardly sat down when a loud crash echoed from her front door. She froze, every nerve on edge as the door burst open, and 3 masked men stormed in, weapons raised. Kira's training kicked in, and she dove behind the sofa, narrowly dodging a bullet as it tore through the wall behind her. She reached for her firearm, her heart pounding as she braced herself for the confrontation. These weren't just any men. They were Callahan's enforcers, sent to silence her before she could finish her mission. The men moved with deadly efficiency, circling the room and cutting off her escape routes. Kira fired a shot, hitting one of them in the shoulder and causing him to stumble. But the others advanced, their movements calculated and relentless. She scanned the room, looking for an opening, a way to turn the tide. Her gaze fell on a heavy bookshelf just a few feet away, and an idea sparked in her mind. She fired another shot to force them back, then lunged for the shelf, shoving it with all her strength. The heavy wood toppled forward, crashing down on one of the men and pinning him beneath it. Taking advantage of the chaos, Kira scrambled toward the hallway, her body moving on instinct. She could hear the remaining enforcer behind her, his footsteps quick and determined. She ducked into the kitchen, grabbing a cast-iron skillet from the counter just as he rounded the corner. Without hesitation, she swung the skillet with all her strength, catching him across the face and sending him crashing to the floor, unconscious. She stood over him, her breathing ragged, adrenaline coursing through her veins. The apartment was silent now, the only sound her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She knew this attack was just a taste of what Callahan was willing to do, a final desperate attempt to silence her. But she was still standing, and she wasn't going to let him win. The following day, the city was buzzing with the news of Callahan's exposure. Headlines splashed across newspapers, his face plastered on every screen. The media storm had begun, and there was no hiding now. His empire was unraveling, piece by piece, his loyalists scattering as the full weight of law enforcement bore down on them. Kira and her team worked tirelessly, coordinating arrests, interrogating associates, and dismantling Callahan's network. Every hour brought new revelations, new pieces of the puzzle that showed just how deeply rooted his cartel had been in the city. But with every arrest, every asset seized, his power dwindled, leaving him more vulnerable than ever. Late that night, Kira received a call from Riley. "It's over, Kira," he said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "We got him." Callahan was found hiding in a private estate outside the city. "He's in custody now." A wave of relief washed over her. They had done it. After months of relentless work, countless close calls, and risking their lives, they had brought down one of the most powerful criminal empires in the city. Callahan would face justice, and his empire would crumble. The next morning, Kira stood outside the courthouse as Callahan was led inside, handcuffed and surrounded by federal agents. She met his gaze as he passed, his eyes filled with fury and defiance. But she saw something else there too: fear. For the first time, Callahan was powerless, unable to buy his way out or manipulate those around him. As he disappeared into the courthouse, Kira felt a profound sense of closure. She had fought not just against a criminal, but against a corrupt system that had allowed him to thrive. And in the end, justice had prevailed. Riley joined her, a triumphant smile on his face. "It's done, Kira. We did it." She nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. "Yeah, we did. And hopefully, it'll send a message that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." They stood together, watching as the doors of the courthouse closed behind Callahan. The battle had been long and hard-fought, but they had won. And for the first time in a long time, Kira felt a sense of peace, knowing that they had made a difference, that they had stood up against the darkness and emerged victorious. As she walked away from the courthouse, she knew there would be other battles, other challenges. But she